All right, you're very welcome along to the NFL show ahead of Week 6. We're taping this on a Wednesday, so by the time we go live, there's an outside chance that maybe Jason Garrett might already have won the sack race to be the first coach sacked. Either way, there's lots to look back on and plenty to look forward to, including the fixture between the October Patriots and the Kansas City Chiefs, because we all know the September Patriots are no good, but the October ones, well, all of a sudden, a few players back, a few players back from suspension, a few players signed, and suddenly they appear to be able to drop points anytime they want to. So we'll talk about all that. Before we get there, though, let's run you through the results from last week. We're going to talk about these with Sam and Cian, and the first look at the results here. So as I've been talking about, last Thursday night's game, like a mini bye week really for the Patriots, given that they'll have all the way up until late Sunday evening to play, but they absolutely annihilated the Colts 38-24. The Bills beat the Titans 13-12, so that's 2 wins for the Bills already this season. The Steelers, well, it's hard to know what to make of the Steelers. 41-17 winners over the Falcons. The Jets and Sam Darnold killed the Broncos on the ground 34-16. The Chiefs, we were wondering how they would do in the face of the Jacksonville Jaguars defence, and they were absolutely astonishingly good. 30 points to 14. The Lions, not dead yet, 31-23 winners over the Green Bay Packers. The Cleveland Browns with another overtime performance and a win this time, winning 12-9. The Panthers beat the Giants 33-31 with a monster field goal. Cincinnati Bengals came from well back against the Dolphins to roar to victory. And for the second week in a row, I think, the worst quarterback on display in the entire NFL was Ryan Tannehill. So his early season success not really showing up anymore. The Chargers beat the Raiders 26-10. The San Francisco 49ers beaten at home by what had been the worst team in football, the previously winless Arizona Cardinals 28-18, despite the fact that they had all the ball. They had something like 41 minutes time for possession or something ridiculous like that. The Eagles beaten again, this time by the Vikings 23-21. The Seahawks, despite a brilliant performance from Russell Wilson, beaten by the, at the moment, unstoppable Rams 33-31. The Texans won the Battle of Texas, beating the Cowboys 19-16. And then the Saints with Drew Brees just setting record after record after record, absolutely annihilating the Washington Redskins by 43 points to 19. Cian Fahey is going to be along in a little while, but first it's to Cincinnati and the nerve centre of Pro Football Focus, where we can say hello to PFF_Sam, or Sam Monson as he's known outside the internet. Sam, how are you?
Good, Jer. How's it going?
Good. Stats and records and all that kind of stuff. We'll talk a good bit about Drew Brees in a minute, but I did want to ask you about the kickers. What did the PFF stats say about Mason Crosby and what he managed to achieve?
That was pretty horrendous. Kickers generally in the league at the moment seem to be terrible. Mason Crosby obviously had that terrible game. The Browns kicker doesn't appear to be able to fundamentally kick the ball, like from a technical standpoint. Almost every single kick he actually makes appears to be a total fluke. They're knuckleballs that somehow fire their way through the post. It's incredible to watch. And the Vikings kicking situation appears to be so cursed that they're able to take the most accurate kicker in NFL history in Dan Bailey and have him shanking 30-odd yard kicks wide of the post. So it's kind of incredible watching these guys at the moment just collectively struggle.
Yeah, I mean, this is pure psychology, because it's not about bad lines allowing extra pressure on the kickoffs, is it? There's nothing extra here other than the little grey cells of the kicker, right?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, Crosby in particular has gone through stretches in his career where, again, it doesn't look like he can fundamentally kick a ball. He gets like the golfer, the yips, where he just can't make contact properly. And we kind of saw that this week with the Packers game.
And I know everybody always says, why don't teams just fix this? And yet, anytime a team takes a kicker high in the draft, when they think that they've taken a can't miss guy, every time they take a kicker high in the draft, that guy seems to be a miss instead of a hit.
Yeah, I think teams probably dedicate so little resource to actually properly scouting kickers in college. Same way college kickers are almost always an afterthought as well. They're just guys that they bring on. I don't think the teams really dedicate the proper resource to doing it. So you get a guy like Roberto Aguayo, who had the all-time college field goal percentage record, I think the most accurate kicker in college history. But if you actually looked at the kicks he was making, they weren't difficult kicks most of the time. So, PFF's grading on him wasn't very high and wasn't in love with this guy, but he had a big leg and he was the most accurate kicker in college history. And they probably didn't look much beyond that, which you should probably do if you're going to take him in the second round. But a lot of the time you guys drafted, it's either because he's got a huge leg and that's all they care about. They work on the basis that they can fix any kind of technical flaws in his game, or it's because his numbers are insane. They're, the most accurate guy ever. But you probably need to dive a bit deeper than that.
It is mad that so little resources given to an actual scoring play when all the rest of the game is about trying to either stop or manufacture the opportunity to score. This is a proper scoring play that these people are responsible for. Points which it turns out now over the course of a game will cost you defeat or victory.
Yeah, absolutely. And we've seen it happen all the way through this season. It's not just Crosby. The Vikings ended up tying with the Packers earlier in the season because their kicker went 0 for 3 on kicks in that game. And I don't think any of them was beyond 40 yards. They were all short kicks that he missed. Or maybe it was beyond 50 yards, but they were all very makeable kicks, and this guy was 0 for 3. You're right, it's a major problem, and almost all of these kickers seem to go through a phase where they're not in the right rhythm. They just go through this period of missing kicks, and the problem is then you're presented with this situation of, do you cut a guy who you know is a good kicker who's just going through a bad period and try and replace him with a guy who you don't even know if he can go through the good stretch? You just end up in this kind of kicker purgatory of never having a guy. Yeah,
and on the other side of this, you've got Graham Gano, who up to this point, the last I'd heard was him being called Graham Ono for the kicks that he'd missed when people would have him on his fantasy team. He nails one from 61 yards and wins a game for the Carolina Panthers. Like, it is important.
Yeah, and he's a great example of a guy who's gone through stretches where he's been bad and he's missed kicks that he should have made, and he's bounced around a few teams because of that. But he's got the ability to nail a 63-yard game-winning kick. He has a huge leg. He can make spectacular kicks. That one in particular, you hear this all the time, would have been good from 73. I don't know how far it would have been good from, but it had a lot more than 63 yards in it, and 64 yards is the all-time NFL record. So, yeah, that was an incredible kick from Gano.
Yeah, and the other thing is, like, you can literally only try those kicks really at the very end of a game with the last seconds ticking down, because if you miss, obviously there's enough time on the clock for the opposition to kick one from the other side of the field. So it's such a rare occasion that we'll actually get to see these.
Yeah, it's such a field position advantage if you miss one of those kicks because they get it at the spot you missed. You need to have a kicker that you trust to make that kind of distance, and B, you need to be in a situation where giving them the ball at that point in the field is not a big problem. So it is typically those game-ending kicks or end-of-the-half kicks.
One of the other things that I wanted to talk to you about this week was it's very early on for us to be talking about teams having a sense of their identity or fully kind of fleshing themselves out into who they are going to be at the end of the season. But just looking at the records of a lot of the teams going up against each other, there's a few 3-2 versus 2-3, and you feel that if a team is 4-2 or if a team is 3-3, there's a massive psychological difference. There's a team who suddenly gets catapulted into having a 2-game divisional lead against rivals, or there's a team who's above 500 and well above 500, and they think about themselves differently. It just has a bit of a bang of moving week about it a little bit in some of the divisions in particular.
Yeah, and I think last week was the same thing. I think weeks 5 and 6 or so are those weeks where teams kind of start to sort themselves out, where you have these really big season-defining games where if you lose, you're in a major hole, and if you win, suddenly things are okay and you're moving in the right direction again. The Vikings-Eagles game, I think, was a great example of that, where if the Vikings had lost that game, they would have been in a major hole for this season for a team that was expecting to be contending at the end. Now they're back to 500, albeit the NFL's version of 500, where you'll count a tie as as a full game. But they're okay now, right? They fixed everything last week. Everything is not rosy, but the crisis is averted. And there's a lot of teams that are looking at that situation again this week, that they have to win to stop falling in these deep hole. And in particular in the NFC, I think you're going to see that a lot for the next few weeks, because there's so many good teams in the NFC that I think they're all knocking each other off. So these teams who we think are actually quite good are going to be losing a reasonable number of games because they're playing a lot of teams that are quite good as well. Whereas the AFC, I think it's more cut and dry between the teams that are actually good and the teams that really aren't.
Yeah, which actually, it means that teams with quite bad records will probably end up in the playoffs in the NFC this year.
Yeah, I think in particular the NFC East, that division could spend the entire time knocking each other off. They have to play good divisions as well. So the winner of the NFC East may actually be a very good team, but win the division with a 9-7, 10-6 kind of record.
Well, so how worried are you if you're the Philadelphia Eagles then? You know, when Jay goes out for the season, and there's all this rumour about like, oh, don't be surprised if they're looking at David Johnson, don't be surprised if they're looking at Shady, and part of you think this makes no sense, like to invest further draft capital in another running back when that was what you just did with a Jay. Now it worked last season and you're the Super Bowl champion, so you get a bit of a free pass at it, but maybe it does make sense to try and double down and see what you can do.
I think their bigger problem is the salary cap situation. They're something like 10 million plus over next year's cap at the moment already, and if they had to move things around even further to get a guy like David Johnson or LaShawn McCoy under their salary cap, it just puts them in this nightmare situation. They really have loaded up this roster for a Super Bowl run. You know, they did it for this short window last year. I think the window is still open. The good news for them is I don't think running back is this critically game-defining position anymore, the way it used to be. So losing Ajayi is a blow. He is a very good runner. He's great at yards after the contact, all that kind of stuff. But if they get Carson Wentz back on track, if the offensive line plays to its potential again, if the defense, particularly in the secondary, that's where they're really struggling at the moment. If their defensive backs, their coverage really shores itself up, I think they're still a Super Bowl caliber roster even without Jay Ajayi. I don't think they need to push panic buttons to go and find a running back.
So if you are sitting there in those conversations that are happening at the moment, between the GM and the head coach, are you saying don't do anything for now, let's ride out a couple of weeks and let's just make sure that we hover around the 500 mark until the last 6 weeks, 5 weeks, 4 weeks of the season?
I think it makes sense to explore options, right? Jay Ajayi goes down, let's pick up the phone, let's see who's available, let's see how much it costs to bring in any of these guys, and then let's see if it makes any kind of sense, see if we can make it happen from a salary cap standpoint and from a draft capital standpoint. It makes sense to do due diligence, but given what does appear to be available and what it would take to make happen, I just don't think it makes sense to make that move. I think it hamstrings this team too much going forward for next year. Now, maybe they don't care about that. Maybe they are looking at this 2-year window and thinking, okay, if we can repeat as Super Bowl champions, we go down in history and then we'll sort out the future in the future. But if they do have a long-term approach to this, then I think making any kind of rash move for a running back this season probably doesn't make sense.
Yeah, I mean, it's hard to know what you do if you're those guys who have just delivered this. If you're Doug Peterson and Harry Roseman who have managed to cook this thing up, like they have enough credit in the bank long term to make that short term play, to mortgage the long term future, and to go, well, sure, look, the year after we can say we'll be signing Carson Wentz this giant contract. At that point, we'll put our eggs in that basket and hit the reset button.
Yeah, I mean, if you, like I say, it's not necessarily a terrible idea to say if we win back-to-back Super Bowl championships, we go down in history and we'll deal with the rest in the future. And the way the salary cap is structured in today's NFL, there is always ways around it. There's always creative ways of restructuring money, of kicking the can down the road. It's eventually going to catch up to you, and you'll need to kind of do that, push the reset button. But you can kind of play this thing out for a long time, even though it looks ugly on paper heading into a new cap year.
Okay, to talk a little bit about the rest of that division, the Cowboys have Jacksonville rolling into town this weekend. Jacksonville are only 3-2, and the Cowboys are actually 2-3. And this is one of those games where both teams will feel very differently about themselves depending on the result of the weekend. If Jacksonville go 4-2, then suddenly last season, absolutely not a blip. The stuff that we saw from Bortles postseason was all true and all real. But if they lose, then suddenly they're back around 500 again, and you're like, oh, what was that? Are Jacksonville really as good as they say? And if the Cowboys get to 500 again, well then, surely that quietens the talk about Garrett getting sacked.
Yeah, particularly if they do it by beating Jacksonville, who we do think still is a very good team. For the Jaguars, I think it comes down to how they perform in the game, almost how they're playing rather than necessarily the result. If they play well, if that defense looks suffocating again, if Bortles looks anything north of disastrous, I think they'll be okay. Even if they lose the game, Dallas is not necessarily a terrible team. I think they'll be all right with that regardless, depending on how they play. For the Cowboys, though, I think it's back to being what we talked about. It is one of those season-defining games. If you get beaten by the Jags, suddenly you're in a hole compared with the rest of that division. The talk about Jason Garrett, the talk about the struggles of Dak Prescott, Zeke Elliott, the entire offense struggling, everything just magnifies and it grows. And because it's Dallas, it magnifies more than it would most other markets, most other teams, because the media frenzy and what the Dallas Cowboys still represents is so huge. They need to, at the very minimum, find a big result in them to find their maximum potential, because the Jaguars can be beaten, but that defense is still extremely good, and offense is where you've been struggling if you're the Cowboys.
Yeah. I mean, is Garrett a good coach, a mediocre coach, an okay coach, or a bad coach?
It's very difficult to tell. They did one of those Amazon series, the All or Nothing shows, and it was on the Cowboys, and you got all the behind-the-scenes stuff, and he was very different to how I expected him to come across. There was a lot more kind of swearing and rah-rah stuff than you expect for a guy like Jason Garrett. But it appears that when you get to game days, he just kind of seizes up and doesn't really do much. He lets the game play out, and there's no sort of, some coaches want to be very involved in the game day process. You think of a Doug Peterson, and not only is he calling the plays, but he's dealing with those mathematical determinations of when you go for it on fourth down. What do the numbers say? Should we go for it here? All that kind of stuff. Jason Garrett appears to just kind of let the game flow, and whatever happens, happens. And if that's bad, it feels like as a head coach, you should be involved in trying to fix that, trying to head it off before it's too big a problem. And then, the end of this previous game against the Texans, it's just the opposite of the way the league is trending right now, which is this aggression of going for it on fourth down, of understanding that is your best chance mathematically to win the game. If you put yourself in a position of one play for 1 yard with your offense, that's the best thing you have going. The conversion rate of those things is spectacular. If you look at what the Rams did with Jared Goff, it wasn't quite the same situation, but they knew if they got a conversion on 4th and 1, they win the game. It's over. So they went out there, QB sneak. Those things have a success rate at the moment of like 85, 90%, and they won the game. The Cowboys elected to punt it away, and it's just mathematically a terrible decision. There's no way around that. And coaches, I think, run back to this archaic way of thinking of saying, well, what's the worst thing that could happen here? If we don't convert and they score, then I look like an idiot. And you say, well, look, you have to play the numbers. Yes, that is a bad thing that could happen in this situation, but statistically speaking, it's got much less chance of happening than the bad things that can happen if you punt the ball away.
Yeah, I don't really understand how anybody still doesn't kind of have either access to those statistics or understand that you just have to go with it. I don't understand why, when you look at the success that the coaches who are taking the risks are having, how you would still be conservative in the face of the evidence and the trends.
And I think we're reaching a point now where I think they're still living in the past, where the press conference after the game, if you screwed it up, if you went for it and it didn't convert and you lost the game because of that, they would be dealing with all those questions of why did you go for it? Why didn't you punt it away? Play safe. Now I think what's going to happen is we're seeing this change where the questions are going to be, why didn't you go for it? Why did you not take the mathematically sound approach that everybody now has access to? The team, the media, everybody has those numbers. Everybody now knows what the right option is. And when you don't take it, you're going to be taking those questions.
The Colts, correct me if I'm wrong, but the previous week, the Colts brought their punt team out, a timeout was called, and then they went for it. Sean McVay did exactly the same thing, except in Andrew Luck's case, he threw short of the sticks and they didn't convert. And it might have been a longer distance that they had.
I think it was 4th and 5.
Yeah. Whereas, so the Colts there was definitely I'm not really sure about that, but McVay's doing it, and because McVay's doing it at the moment with the Rams, and he's a genius, therefore it's always 100% right. It's very outcome based. It works, therefore it was the right decision. If it doesn't, then but there's definitely whatever McVay is doing, he can do no wrong, whereas the other coaches don't have that credit in the bank just yet.
Yeah, and that's part of the problem, is that some of these situations are very, they're not intuitive, they're counterintuitive. So the Colts one is a similar one where even people within PFF, they were going, well, that was a crazy decision. What were they doing? And when we ran the numbers in our system that predicts these things, we're like, actually, they made the right call. It was a better statistical chance to go for that one, even though it was 4 and 5, and even though they were at, there was time on the clock, they would give the opposition the ball back with a chance to do damage like happened, it was still the mathematically sound decision. Now, then you get to the stage where you say, okay, going for it is the right call, but how are you going for it? What's the play you're dialing up? And there's definitely some criticism in terms of what you actually used to try and go for it. There's definitely situations where you say, okay, you made the right call to go for it, but go for it better. What you called was terrible. And that's a fair criticism.
Yeah, definitely. To go back to the NFC East and the Washington's performance against the Saints, the Giants have been completely up and down and are 1-4, and it's hard to tell if, so they were much better against Carolina after the win they had the previous week than they had been the first 3 weeks. And we've just talked a good bit about Dallas. In fact, like, you can see the Eagles coming out of this division at the end, and just squeaking out.
Yeah, I think those first 3 teams are reasonable. I think the Eagles will still be a good team. They've had a lot go wrong early in the season that probably should even itself out. Particularly those cornerbacks have been playing badly when we know they're better players than that. So I would expect that to kind of swing back in the other direction. Dallas, we talked about. Washington, I think, are a decent roster, but what Monday Night Football showed is that Alex Smith and that offense is just not capable of living with a team in a shootout. So if their defense doesn't show up, if they're not in a close game, if they're not able to keep things in the right kind of rhythm, they could get blown out of games, and that'll happen every now and again. The Giants are the team that I think will struggle in that division. I just don't think they're very good. I think there's too much wrong with that team, top to bottom. The offensive line is still a mess. Eli Manning's not capable of raising the level of everybody around him the way he used to be in his prime. There's too many problems with the defense. Our PFF models before the season suggested that was a team that was among the worst in the game, and I think that's kind of being borne out as the season goes. So I'd expect those 3 teams to fight it out and the Giants to kind of prop up that division.
So who else are the worst teams at the moment then? If we're talking about potential first picks, it looks like the 49ers are right there. It looks like Arizona are probably still right there despite the fact they won a game last week. The Giants, there's not a whole heap after that who you wouldn't, like, even Buffalo are like, well, our quarterback's looking a little bit shifty and our defense is actually really good.
Yeah, I think Buffalo's okay. I think that defense is showing that it's closer to the last season's version than it is this version that opened this season. It looked like they couldn't stop anybody. Last season their defense was very good, and I think it's starting to get back to that level again. That's going to be good enough to propel them, to a few wins. So I think Buffalo's okay. The teams you mentioned are definitely among the worst in the game. I think Arizona is as bad as anybody, even if they somehow conspired to win that game against the 49ers with a bunch of crazy turnovers. I think the Raiders are still a very bad team, and they could end up being down there when all is said and done.
Yeah, so it's a short enough list at this point. I just wanted to get your take on the Patriots and the change. Obviously, we talked just before they played last week, and it made a significant difference to have Julian Edelman back, and it made a significant difference, it seems, to have a big burly wide receiver in Josh Gordon, who can now take away some of the coverage that you would ordinarily have been able to use your good matchups on Gronkowski, and that just transforms everything really quickly in the space of 2 players.
It really does, and it was a perfect example of everything we talked about. I actually did a video up on PFF's YouTube channel about the impact that Edelman makes after that game. And right from the first drive, they came out and they were just firing him these quick passes over the middle. Just 5 yards, turn around, I'll fire you the ball, and we'll start moving the ball that way. And, Brady's average time to throw when he was targeting Edelman was like a second faster than anybody else. He just gets rid of the ball quicker. And you can see the effect that then has on a defense. So suddenly 3 guys in the middle of the field are now turning and focusing on where Julian Edelman is. And you're getting linebackers that are essentially running out of their zone to deal with Edelman just hooking up short of the first down markers. And now there's a guy over here that's wide open because Edelman is drawing so much attention. So he does all that to the underneath game. And then we got to see what Josh Gordon can do, which is he gives you that Randy Moss ability to go, okay, we're 5 seconds into the play. Still nobody's open. To hell with it. I'm just going to throw it deep and let him go get it. And Brady did that at one point. He was just bouncing back there for what seemed like an age. Nobody's open. And he just heaved it into double coverage in the direction of Josh Gordon in the end zone. And Josh Gordon is capable of going up and making that into a spectacular play. Brady did that a lot during the Randy Moss time. and hasn't really had a guy to do it with since then. But it just gives him an option that he doesn't have before. So you put those two things together, and you're talking about a completely different offense, because you still got James White. He's a weapon out of the backfield. You've still got other guys that can be complementary pieces. But now you've got two players that make this thing work in a completely different way. And it really is a different Patriots offense with them there.
Yeah, and so early on we were wondering if maybe the Dolphins are going to be able to run them close over the course of the entire season. That doesn't really look like it's going to happen after the last couple of weeks.
No.
So are we shooing the Patriots, assuming that Brady stays fit, are we shooing them straight into the playoffs and maybe another home bye, given what we've just seen on the basis of what Edelman and Gordon do to the offense?
Yeah, I think they're definitely going to go back to the playoffs, win that division. You know, it's always as much down to the rest of the division as it is the Patriots. And as much as the Jets, the Bills, and the Dolphins are all capable of winning games, I think the Dolphins against the Patriots showed that they're just not in the same class. And I think that was a big game for both teams. You know, the Dolphins, they were 3-0. They had this chance to really put the Patriots in a hole, and they got absolutely blown out. They got eviscerated. And that must have been a body blow for their confidence. And then again, this week, 17 points up against Cincinnati, and somehow conspire to blow that completely as well. So the Dolphins, it wouldn't shock me if they went kind of in the tank from this point on. And neither of the other two teams are good enough to do anything in terms of running the Patriots close. So at this point, I'd expect them to, you know, march inexorably towards another division victory the way they usually do. And then, you know, the playoffs, they'll be one of the contenders again, obviously.
Yeah, for sure. Anything else you're looking forward to seeing this weekend, or do you think we should be talking about?
No, this is, I think, a really fascinating week because of all the stuff we just talked about. It's big, do-or-die matchups for a bunch of teams. And I think sort of weeks 5, 6, 7 are the most interesting of the NFL season, because they're the weeks that really define what teams are. You know, the starts can be a little bit misleading. Sometimes teams get off to hot starts, then go back. These are the real crunch weeks of the NFL season.
Sam, great stuff. Thanks a million for joining us again.
Anytime. Thanks, man.
It's Sam Monson there. Check out his stuff at PFF_Sam, and you can obviously check out the stuff on YouTube that Sam was talking about there. They upload a bunch of their videos where they explain how their stats actually work. We're going to speak to Cian Fahey in a moment. I'll run you through this week's fixtures just to give you an idea of what is worth looking out for. That Monday Night Football game is not worth looking at. That's the 49ers of the Packers. That's going to be relatively straightforward from the Packers' perspective. But they need a win, and they need to get back on track pretty quickly. So it'll be interesting to see just how well they do play, and if their quarterback's knee injury is starting to clear up at all, because without him and without that wide receiver core, last week he was passing to guys who were rookies you've never heard of before. But let's just go back. So Thursday Night Football this week, it's the Eagles at the Giants. A win there for the Eagles would leave the Giants 1-5, and would get the Eagles back on track. It's the Bucks at the Falcons. The Falcons also 1-4, but like by far the best 1-4 team in football at the moment. The Panthers going really well. Redskins not so much, but on the road, let's see what Cam's made of this week. The Seahawks at the Raiders, again, two bad teams at the moment, but really the best quarterback on the show is for the Seahawks. It's the Colts at the Jets, the Cardinals at the Vikings. Should be a routine victory for Minnesota. The Steelers at the Bengals is a great game, actually. All of a sudden, the Bengals look like they've got everything going for them. They have a bunch of receivers. They've got two proper running backs. Their defense is as good as it ever was. I think Vontaze Burfict was back last week, and the Steelers also showed up in a big way last week. So we'll see exactly if that connection that Antonio Brown had with Ben Roethlisberger last week is back. The Chargers at the Browns. Browns are good at football. The Bills at the Texans. The Bears at the Dolphins. Again, the Bears after the bye week, coming back off that incredible performance from Trubisky where he was perfect. So it'll be interesting to see if he can maintain that through the hype and the break. The Rams at the Broncos. I mean, you know, back in the day we would have said, ooh, this is offense versus defense, but the Broncos got ripped apart on the ground by the Jets last week, so it's really just the Rams against themselves. The Ravens at the Titans. Well, that could be a 3-3 draw, and we'll talk about that with Cian in just a minute. The Jags at the Cowboys, as we've been talking about, should be pretty interesting. And then the Chiefs at the Patriots, undoubtedly the pick of the lot is the late game on Sunday night. And I think that we do actually have Cian Fahey with us, fresh from his sojourn at Oktoberfest. Cian, how are you? Is fresh the right word?
Today. Wednesday's all right. Tuesday, Monday wasn't so great.
Is it worth going to? I've never been.
Oh, yeah, it's worked. The key, though, I think you should probably go earlier in it. We went last year in the first weekend, and it was great. Everyone was happy and having a great time. And we went there the last weekend, which was on Saturday and Sunday, and the waitresses and waiters were kind of sick of doing it for 3 weeks at that point, so they were a little bit less likely to sit around with you and have the crack for all day. They kind of force your order and get you out of there and keep you moving.
Yeah, okay, all right. I can completely understand that. Let's talk a little bit about the Titans. I know that's something that you wanted to talk about. We had thought that maybe the Titans were one of those teams who was going to, win dirty early on in the season and then come good as an offense built around the McVay, Shanahan, West Coast principles. And then last week they let us down.
Yeah, I think they're interesting to me at the moment because I think over the past couple of weeks they've shot themselves in the foot a little bit at different times. And this game against the Bills was a major part of that, where Taywan Taylor had a fumble at the very start of the game. It was in Titans territory. The Bills took over. Josh Allen runs in a touchdown. And then pretty much after that, the offense does very little. But the Titans just couldn't put drives together. They couldn't get them. They kept kicking field goals, but they couldn't put touchdowns together. And they had Mariota had an interception in quarter 2, and Nick Williams ran the wrong route. And Dion Lewis had another fumble at midfield again. And it was all very much these errors that could be easily avoided, and it wasn't really about what the defense was doing, it was about what the offense was doing to itself. And these are things I like to look out for over the first 8-9 weeks of the season, because you can take the result, you can take, hey, this team beat this team, so that defense was better than that offense, or you can look at how these plays are happening. And that's kind of a big detail for moving forward, because an offense is less likely to keep beating itself, whereas if it's a defense actually shutting down the offense, it's probably a talent issue. I like this Titans team, and I do think they're going to get better as the year goes along rather than gets worse, even though there are big questions there after they released Rashard Matthews. They just released Nick Williams, who kind of played a little bit in his wake, and because he had a big drop and that mistake on interception. So they need a little bit more offensive firepower. But overall, I like the direction of that team. And in the AFC, you kind of want to look for these guys who can be just getting into the playoffs and then getting a little bit hot.
A lot of preseason hype about Taywan Taylor and Corey Davis and that receiving core and how they were going to make a big leap forward. It just hasn't quite happened on any consistent basis for them just yet.
Yeah, I think Corey Davis is really good. He's played well. He's going to be one of those guys who's an above-average starter for 10 or 15 years, probably never going to be a DeAndre Hopkins or someone spectacular, but he's looked really good. He's looked the part. He's a big receiver. He's very agile, I guess is the best word. He's not really a sprinter. He's someone who can work the underneath and work the intermediate, make guys miss and break tackles against smaller defensive backs in space. Taylor is a guy who people generally like to get excited about. He's explosive. He can get out in space. He can have these highlight plays on screens, but he lacks the kind of technique and he lacks the size. And you can see with him the inconsistency is there. Ideally, he wouldn't really be in the offense that much. Rashard Matthews would be, and it's why Tajay Sharp has played so much for them. Tajay Sharp is a lot less exciting, I guess, because he's slower, he's rangier, and he's limited as an overall player, but he runs better routes, and I guess he has better hands and a wider catch radius. So it's easier for Mariota to get the ball to Tajay Sharp, whereas Taylor is still relying on being schemed open a little bit. The
run game, you mentioned Dion Lewis there, he's mostly been used as a receiver, and Derrick Henry was supposed to be the perfect complement to Dion Lewis, but Henry has been underwhelming for the majority, really, of his Tennessee career. How much of this is because the offensive line isn't very good and they haven't quite managed to get the right scheme going for him, or is he maybe just a mediocre running back?
Maybe I'm a little bit biased in this sense, but I've never really seen anything from him that tells me he's as good as any of the better running backs in the league. The selling point with Henry is he has this massive body and he runs a 4.4, whatever. He's like a sprinter in this massive body. But he reminds me of Brandon Jacobs, who was a huge back for the New York Giants all those years ago. But Brandon Jacobs never ran like he was big. He ran like he was Dion Lewis. He ran like someone who wanted to get outside and move sideways and make these quick turns. At Alabama, it didn't matter because it was wide open running lanes all the time. In Tennessee, in the NFL, for every team, you're always going to have more narrow running lanes. You're always going to have to be a little bit more disciplined, and he just doesn't have that. He looks for the sideline, he runs sideways. Lewis is such a better player, not even if you discount the receiving elements of it. Lewis is just a better player because he's smarter and he understands how to manipulate defenders and how to react to his blocking.
Ultimately, it's all going to come down to what level of progress we see from Mariota, and that dictates where the ceiling for the team is. Like, are they a playoff team who can win playoff games? Are they a playoff team who can go deep into January? Is this the bones of a Super Bowl team? How impressed are you with them?
I think the big thing is they're the challenger for the Jaguars. We can kind of talk about the playoffs or whatever, but in that AFC South, they are that team who is right there with the Jaguars for me. I know the Texans are pretty, like, they've had some positives over recent weeks, but they're a bad start, and I don't think they're going to sustain success. I just don't think that roster is that good. Mariota, to me, is the best quarterback in the division. No, well, I'm kind of discounting luck because I feel like that whole Colts situation is just being rebuilt. He's kind of a year away. The roster is kind of a year away from being competitive again. And that's kind of what you normally get when you have a new coach in Frank Reich. So I think of the competitive teams there, I feel like Mariota is the best quarterback. And we saw that with Blake Bortles when he went into Kansas City and had a complete meltdown. And Bortles is always liable to do that. If you have Mariota fully healthy, he hasn't been fully healthy to this point, he's not going to be like Bortles. He's going to be able to carry that offense a little bit more, and he's going to be able to create when things break down. Obviously, he needs better help from his supporting cast. He needs his receivers to catch the ball more consistently. But I think they'll be fine moving forward. Like I said, he's a very, very good player, and he's someone I kind of talk about a lot because I'm always very interested in a quarterback who is very good but in a bad situation, so people don't realize how good he is. So you kind of like to talk those guys up. It's a little bit more interesting than pointing to a guy who already has loads of stats and everyone can see his highlight plays everywhere.
Yeah, for sure. Let's double back and talk a little bit about the Eagles, because you wanted to talk about them. What is it about this Eagles team at the moment that is preventing them from being as good as last season's Eagles team?
Well, they got through that Nick Foles start to the season. Like, Nick Foles didn't play well, but because Matt Ryan was so bad in week 1, they managed to come out of that 1-1, and you kind of felt like they had set the table, they'd survived what they needed to survive with Foles, and then you bring in Carson Wentz, and they struggle past the Colts. They just about win in week 3, and then since then they've lost 2 games. The big thing for me is I don't think Wentz is playing that much differently to what he played last year. But this year, the offensive line is not anywhere close to what it was last year. Lane Johnson, in particular, the right tackle there, who is widely celebrated the best right tackle in football, he was given a contract with the idea of becoming the team's long-term left tackle. They've ultimately decided to just keep him at right tackle because he's been so dominant there. He got worked a little bit by a guy called Stephen Weatherly, who no one is going to know. Stephen Weatherly is a nice athlete who Mike Zimmer is high on, who's been developing over the last couple of years. But Stephen Weatherly is not supposed to be on the field. Stephen Weatherly is only playing because Everson Griffin is absent from the team. And Weatherly came in and he kept beating Lane Johnson across his face. And then you had Daniel Hunter working Jason Peters on the other side. And there was some interior pressure as well, working against the left guard. They swapped out Stefan Wisniewski for Isaac Ciamolo, whose name I hope I got right, but I don't think I did. And they have this kind of offensive line now that can be attacked a little bit. Whereas last year they had this offensive line that nobody could do anything against. So Carson Wentz's processing in the pocket now is under a little bit more stress. He had 2 interceptable passes last week, but more importantly, for the season so far, he's averaging 4 sacks a game. He had 2 sacks per game in his 13 sacks last year. So the difference there is monstrous because you're starting from a point now where you have more negative plays built into your drive. So you've now got to overcome longer second downs, you've got to overcome longer third downs, and you set yourself up for more fourth down opportunities probably.
Is that because of the teams they've played, or is it because they're weaker? So, like, is it possible that Minnesota have got their shit together properly and are going to do that to every team they play? Like, the sample size, basically my argument here is the sample size argument is pretty small.
Yeah, it is, but I think the Colts are a team they should have beaten easily, should have handled more easily. As much as the Colts defense has played better than we expected with Marcus Hunt, I think Jamal Sheard is there as well. And then you have the Titans defense, which is fine. It's nothing spectacular, but this has been a consistent trend even when Wentz wasn't there. Against the Tampa Bay Buccaneers, it was an issue. Against the Falcons, it was an issue. These are generally good defensive fronts. But last year, it did not matter who was across the line from them. Last year, they went against the Denver Broncos, a very good defensive front 7, and put 50 points on them because they were able to dominate that front 7 and make Von Miller irrelevant. And they just haven't done that this year. Now,
they do have the Giants on Thursday night this week, so it's not the worst week for them to be licking their wounds and going, what are we going to... to the Giants, it's okay. We've got this one.
Well, yes and no. It's as we've seen so far this year, playing on the road on Thursday night after a Sunday game is not easy no matter who you play. And the Giants, to me, look like they're kind of getting themselves together a little bit. They just released Eric Flowers this week, which is a big thing for them because it's not really a short-term thing because he was already on the bench. But long-term, when you have a coach who is willing to actually make changes, a big problem with McAdoo was he would keep rolling Flowers out there at left tackle over and over and over again, never giving him help, never doing anything to change the whole thing up, never benching him to try someone else, and you knew it was going to happen each week. Pat Shurmur is the new coach there, and obviously they've had their little bit of growing pains at the start of this season. They've faced some pretty tough defenses so far as well, and I feel like they're going to get better because you've got a coach there now who's actually making adjustments. How much better can you get with Eli Manning as your quarterback and with that offensive line talent as a whole? That's to be determined. I'm not sure how good they can be, but I don't think this will be an easy game for the Eagles because I talked about their offense. Defensively, they've been picked apart a little bit of times this year. Teams know how to attack them because they're not getting the production they expected to get from their defensive line with adding Michael Bennett and Haloti Ngata to Derek Barnett to Fletcher Cox to Chris Long. Like, they have this hugely deep defensive line rotation, but it's still not overwhelming teams the way you expect it to.
Yeah, okay. You did want to also talk about the Packers, who are 2-1 up against the San Francisco 49ers this week. In a game you would expect the Packers to kind of roll over the 49ers.
Yeah, well, I think that's kind of a safe bet, I guess, because the 49ers it feels like the 49ers season is already over.
Oh, totally.
Like it's even though they have pieces they can develop, but in terms of contending week to week games, especially against teams with good quarterbacks, it's very hard to see what they're going to do. Again, this is similar to what I was talking about with the Titans. This is a team I wanted to look at because it felt like they kind of beat themselves or got a little bit unlucky against this Lions team. There was obviously the 3 missed field goals and the 1 missed extra point with Mason Crosby. Crosby's a good kicker in general. I think he'll be fine. As far as I know, they haven't cut him since. They should keep hold of him. He will be fine. He'll turn that back around. He had that similar situation 4 or 5 years ago. But kind of what stood out to me as well was, again, they had this punt where the ball hit off a Packers player without the Packers player realising, so the ball became live, and they got the ball at the 1 yard line. That led to a touchdown. Then they had another fumble on the deep in Packers territory on the 29, and it kind of just set the Lions up to, I think the Lions had 1 long touchdown drive in this game as a whole, really. So it kind of set the Lions up to win the game with Aaron Rodgers kind of had no real impact because his kicker missed all those field goal attempts, and because the defense was because the special teams had turned the ball over. I think the Packers are going to get better as well as the season goes along. I think now that Rodgers is talking out a little bit about his coaching staff and telling them to be a little bit more thoughtful with their play calling, I think the offense will be better, and I think the defense is kind of growing with all these younger players. Like Jair Alexander is a guy who I've enjoyed watching so far this year. Yeah,
they also had a lot of injuries to the receiving core, and a bunch of people you've never heard of all of a sudden are like catching 6 passes for 60 yards and a touchdown. And I mean, this is the receiver core who felt the lash of Aaron Rodgers' tongue in preseason when he was like, all of these receivers are not working hard enough, with the exception of Geronimo Allison. And suddenly he's actually throwing to them and building up a little bit of trust with them, despite the fact that he doesn't have Randall Cobb and he doesn't have Allison. And in those circumstances, then, plus the 10 points they left on the table, you can kind of feel like the result is far less important than the quality of that team's performance, particularly because we do feel like Aaron Rodgers is getting healthier, and as he gets healthier, he's going to get much better.
Yeah, you would assume so. They have a young guy called Equanimous St. Brown there as well. They've got options, and the running backs there are pretty good. They've enough talent to get by. Jimmy Graham can be a little more relied on a little bit more, used a little bit more than he has been so far, I think. The Packers as a whole, I still think the Vikings are the best team in that division. I think the Bears are probably just behind them, assuming Mitchell Trubisky has kind of turned the corner a little bit after his big game 2 weeks ago. They had the bye week last week. I just feel like with Aaron Rodgers there, with the Packers team as a whole, which the direction they're going, I kind of, a few weeks ago, probably, and I know it's a weird thing to say because they lost to the Lions and they lost pretty convincingly, but I feel kind of better about that team now than I did 2 or 3 weeks ago. Like, Rodgers obviously looking healthy is a big plus. I still think they're behind the Bears and behind the Vikings, but that group there is going to be interesting, and it could be like the NFC South last year where you had 3 playoff teams. I was literally about to ask you, are we talking about the potential of 3 playoff teams here? Because if the NFC East keeps taking games off each other, then there's not only going to be one team who comes out of that, and that'll be, you could even have an 8-8 record and qualify for that. So that's one of your playoff spots gone. The Panthers and the Saints are both coming out of their division, are they? I would assume so, yeah. I feel like I know you mentioned the Falcons and you mentioned how good they are as a 1-4 team, but they're done. The Buccaneers are a disaster. I think the Panthers are really, really good, and that's part of why I'm not so down on the Giants, because losing to that Panthers team isn't embarrassing to anyone really. That's a good football team. And then the Saints, we saw what they did on Monday night. Drew Brees destroyed the Washington defense, just tore them apart. And the Washington defense was aided a little bit by Alex Smith not seeing open receivers over and over and over again. But they still played better, I feel like, and I think they're going in the right direction, even though they need to get more from a guy like Max Williams at safety. Sheldon Rankins had a big sack in that game. Like him, Cameron Jordan, the rookie, Marcus Davenport, I believe is his name. those guys have to kind of keep developing as they keep going on this year, because they have the talent there to be a really good pass rushing unit.
It's mad given that we have only 5 weeks in the books, but we're effectively saying that it's the Vikings, Bears, Packers, Saints and Panthers that it's going to be 3 of those teams who qualify.
We're saying it. That doesn't mean it's going to happen.
4 out of those 5 who are going to qualify. But, it will, because the Rams are going to win their division. Nobody else is going to be close to qualifying from it. Maybe one of the other teams in the NFC East makes 10 games and suddenly 10 games is the target. But if you're the Packers, you're chasing the Saints and the Panthers and the other teams in your division, and you just have to finish ahead of 3 of those and you're in, which, it's good that we know these things.
It is that NFC West thing that's kind of I guess the argument would have been that the 49ers would have been the second team there.
Yeah. And
that's just not going to happen now. I don't think that was going to happen in the first place, but that kind of takes away the competitiveness of the NFC.
Yeah, no, totally. They've been completely destroyed with injuries. It hasn't just been Garoppolo. They're throwing the ball to no marks. Apparently they ran something like 60% screens last week, which... and
I haven't checked that yet, but that would be probably a historic number.
It was insane. It was the entire first drive was these little short passes. He made far more yards after the catch from balls thrown behind the line of scrimmage than he did over it. And you're that doesn't normally happen that much.
That's what you're always going to get when you go to these backup quarterbacks, though, especially a guy like CJ Beathard, who... Beathard is probably more of an athlete than a quarterback, so he's going to stare down these shorter throws. He's not going to risk throwing the ball into the actual coverage, and it's going to be a nightmare for the rest of the year.
Cian, great stuff. Thanks very much for joining us.
Thanks, man.
It's Cian Fahey with us here every week on OTB's NFL pod. We didn't get a chance to show you the tweets, the tweet storm that was going after the Redskins Saints game. It doesn't matter now. Oh yeah, there you go. So it's Michael Thomas and Josh Norman. I made that boy check out after the first half. You clout chasing. Is he clown? Is he 25 times lined it up toe to toe, blocking decoy? Outcome of that 0-0-0. Drew didn't even look your damn way. Juice, waste of a tweet. But Josh Norman did get subbed off by Jay Gruden. So and then this goes on. I like this. I like the fact that this exists in the world today, where athletes are actually talking to each other in the aftermath of a game. Josh Norman did get benched for five plays in the match, though, so you gotta say that Michael Thomas ends up winning this one. You, my son, go to bed, son. I was punking you all night. Give me a break. At your coach, so we can put your so-called tough guy self in time out again. Yeah, Michael Thomas won, Josh Norman 0, or maybe it's 2-0 after the weekend there. You got benched, stop it. And there's a lot of people talking about that. So all of a sudden we're all following at Can't Guard Mike. That's your lot this week. We'll see you on the radio and on OTB AM. In the meantime, if you're not subscribed to any of our good stuff on wherever it is that you get your podcasts, then please do. And sure, we'll see you in the meantime. Otherwise, I'll see you next week. Good luck.